we watch this clip, I want you to imagine something. Imagine someone who has taken advantage of you, not just once, but as part of a system that actively works against you, day after day. Imagine someone who profited from your labor, who looked you in the eye and took more than what was fair, to the point where you struggled to survive. Now, imagine Jesus telling you to forgive that person and accept him or her as a peer. This scene from The Chosen imagines what it might have been like for Peter. It's not a passage of scripture word for word, but it's faithful to what the gospel offers. Peter and Matthew were from the same town. It's quite likely that Matthew was Peter's tax collector. And if he wasn't, it would have been someone just like Matthew. Peter and Andrew, as well as all the other fishermen, would have been taxed on the right to fish, on their equipment, on the haul of fish that they got, and on the trade or export of them. Some things never change, right? But Matthew may have been the very person enforcing this system, the guy who skimmed off the top every day, because that's how tax collectors made their living. Rome required a certain amount, so the tax collectors would collect that amount, and anything more they collected, they got to keep. And there were no one richer in these villages than the tax collectors. So here's Peter sitting at the campfire with Jesus, discussing the very man who exploited him. And Jesus is talking about forgiveness. That was a pretty raw scene. Peter doesn't hide his pain. He doesn't pretend it didn't happen. And Jesus doesn't dismiss it either. He sits there with Peter, refusing to take sides and also refusing to let go of either one of them. Jesus knows that if Peter continues to harbor his grudge, it will cost him a whole lot more than taxes ever did. This is what discipleship looks like. It's not just about following Jesus. It's about learning to live in community with people that we may not trust, or don't fully understand, or maybe even resent. Jesus didn't wait for Peter and Matthew to work out all of their issues before he called them. He called them and knew that that would come. Maybe that's where we are today, sitting with people who have hurt us, whether it's here or at home, in our community or workplace, or wherever. We may be struggling with what forgiveness really means. And just as a side note, forgiveness and reconciliation are two completely different issues. Sometimes reconciliation isn't appropriate, but it shouldn't be confused with forgiveness. And we may wonder how far grace is really supposed to go. Jesus says, "Follow me, all of you." And it's not the only conflict happening among the disciples. Did you ever stop and think about what it would have been like for those disciples to have been together? I never really spent a lot of time imagining their differences, but they were people. People are people, and we're all different. Some people lead with their minds and reason. Other people lead with their gut and what they feel. We're all different. But beyond that, there were some stark contrasts among the disciples. James and John, man, they were the sons of thunder and were ambitious and wanted to be Jesus's guys. And in front of everyone, they said, "Hey, Jesus, can we sit at your right hand when you come into glory?" How do you think the other disciples might have responded to that situation? Especially Peter, who had, with his role and his need to be in control. And there were two disciples named Simon, the one we're more familiar with, who Jesus said, "You will now be known as Peter." But also there was Simon the Zealot. We don't hear much about him, but we do know a lot about the Zealots. The Zealots, they were a political group, and they were very passionate and committed to the overthrow of Rome with arms. They trained for that day to rise up and take Rome out of Jerusalem. And there is a specific branch, a subgroup of the Zealots known as the Sicarii. Comes from the word of Sicas, the dagger that they used. But they were like first century ninjas. These guys would carry their small curved daggers inside of their cloaks. And in crowded spaces like festivals or what have you, they would sneak through the crowds and come up on their opponents. And by opponent, that's anyone who supported Rome. And they would take them out and then get lost inside the crowd. They were political assassins in the midst of everyday life. They worked with stealth. They were committed to committing these assassinations to get Rome out of Jerusalem. They operated in secret cells, and they had a total commitment to their cause, even the willingness to die for what they were doing. So for Simon, the zealot, someone like Matthew was a target that he had trained for and had committed his life to removing. Killing Matthew would have been an act that Simon was ready to take care of. But for Jesus, Matthew would have been gone. Now imagine Jesus calling both of them, Simon that we know as Peter, who was completely taken advantage of by Matthew, and Simon the Zealot, who was sharpening his blade as he watched Matthew, and Jesus calling all of them together to sit at the same table, to break bread together, to follow the same path. And then there's Judas. While most of the disciples came from the northern area in Israel, Palestine, the area around Galilee, Judas Iscariot, as his name implies, comes from Kerioth, which is down by Jerusalem outside of Judea. And that was a suburb of Jerusalem. It was a different region with different assumptions, a different culture, and maybe he even had an urban mindset. He was the group's treasurer, handling the money, and he seemed to have been more calculating and reserved than the others. But he wasn't a fisherman or a tradesman like the other disciples. He did not share the same roots or the same accent, and likely never fit in the same way. Imagine, and I'm going to lean into some poor stereotypes here, but imagine a Yankee in a suit with a bunch of rednecks. That would describe the dynamic with Judas and the other disciples. Jesus chose him too. He didn't form a community by looking for compatibility. He called people just as they were, knowing they likely wouldn't get along. He called people into proximity, into tension, so that they could learn the value of forgiveness, that they could learn what grace really means. And he called people who had every reason to walk away, and he gave them what a reason to stay. That's a point worth discussing, don't you think? Jesus taught them differently, just like us. Jesus taught Simon the Zealot that the revolution wasn't going to come through swords and schemes and overthrowing power. It would come through self-giving love, one heart at a time. Jesus could have gone to the government places, but he didn't. He went to the people. Simon had to unlearn the idea that enemies must be destroyed and learn that enemies can be redeemed. Today there are folks just like Simon, people who burn with righteous anger, who are tired, who want to take up the sword in word or action and just burn it all down and start over. Jesus says to them, there's a better way. Lay down your weapons and take up grace. Jesus taught Matthew, the tax collector, that grace wasn't earned and worth wasn't determined by wealth or security. Matthew had built a life shielding and protecting himself. He had built up a lot of wealth to survive any kind of difficult time. He had power, and he had connections with the right folks, the people in power. And Jesus walked right through all of that and said, follow me. In fact, in the scriptures, we read that Matthew was in his tax booth when Jesus approached and called him from that life to follow him. Today, there are people like Matthew who have built up security in wealth, in power, and in connections. They feel that without their power or their wealth, that maybe they're just not deserving. Maybe there are people that feel that as long as I have what I need, you can worry about yourself. And Jesus says to them, you are not your worst decision. You are not what others call you. Your security does not come from wealth or power or connections, but from the community I prepare for you. Come, follow me. And Jesus taught Peter that strength isn't always loud and leadership does not always mean control. Peter wanted to fight, to fix, to prove himself, and to hold on to his righteous anger and his grudges. And Jesus kept bringing him back to humility, to listening, and to love. Today, there are a lot of folks like Peter who think they have to be right, who have to hold everything together, and who feel responsible for everyone and everything and can't let go of past harms. Jesus says to them, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out. Let the grace you received be an example of what you can give. Just keep following. Jesus met each disciple where they were. He did not offer cookie cutter answers or a one-fits-all discipleship. He looked at Simon's fire, Matthew's fear, and Peter's pride and loved them all through it. And he does the same for us. Whatever your stumbling block is, anger, shame, control, grief, pride, fear, Jesus doesn't walk away. He teaches and he calls patiently, persistently, gently. And he teaches us how to sit at the table together. There are so many forces in this world working to splinter us, to divide us by race, politics, class, or conviction, to convince us that people who think differently, vote differently, love differently, or live differently are the enemy, and that the only safe community is the one that agrees with us. But Jesus calls us together. Jesus doesn't build communities of sameness. He builds communities of transformation. And transformation happens not in echo chambers, but at the table. The table where we gather as a church, or as a family, with friends, or as a community. Jesus called zealots and tax collectors, skeptics and hotheads, liberals and conservatives. He calls people who have every reason to walk away from each other and gives us a reason to stay. And then he makes us into a church. So maybe the most courageous prayer we can pray this Lent want is, Jesus, teach me to stay at the table. Teach me to love the one I don't understand. Teach me to be uncomfortable. Teach me to listen more than I speak. Teach me to ask questions to understand someone that I would rather just ignore or dismiss or cut off from. Teach me to forgive, especially when I don't want to. Teach me, Jesus, to follow you, even when it means walking beside people I'd rather avoid. The world is teaching us how to hate. Jesus teaches us how to love. And that kind of love, it may just save us all. Thanks be to God. Amen. Shall we sing? Please stand as you're able.